Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up, grab your popcorn, and prepare to have your mind blown, because today on Boss Economics World, we're diving headfirst into the fiscal dumpster fire that is Washington's latest budget bill. That's right, folks, the US government is back at it again, serving up a piping hot dish of economic recklessness, fiscal irresponsibility, and good old-fashioned denial. And as always, your boy boss is here to break it down, from the surface-level shenanigans to the deep, dark economic abyss that's staring us all in the face. Spoiler alert, it ain't pretty, and the clowns running the show have stopped even pretending to care. Let's get into it. Last week, for those keeping score, the US House of Representatives passed a budget bill so colossal, so reckless, it could add anywhere between $3 trillion and $5 trillion to the federal deficit over the next decade. Yes, you heard that right, trillion with a T. And guess what? The Senate's probably gonna rubber stamp this bad boy faster than you can say, fiscal apocalypse. But here's the kicker, nobody in Washington is even blinking an eye. No debate, no outrage, no furrowed brows over whether this is fiscally reckless. Nope. All that matters is who gets the tax cuts, who gets the spending goodies, and who gets to pose for the cameras looking like a hero. Meanwhile, the economy? Oh, it's just a ticking time bomb, but hey, why worry about that when you can score political points, right? Now, let's put this in perspective for the everyday folks out there, our loyal viewers who've been grinding, saving, and trying to make sense of this financial madhouse. The US national debt is already sitting at a jaw-dropping $35 trillion as of early 2025, according to the US Treasury Department. That's over 120% of GDP, folks, and climbing faster than a squirrel on an espresso bender. And now, with this budget bill, they're planning to pour another $5 trillion of gasoline on the fire? Are you kidding me? This is like handing a pyromaniac a flamethrower and saying, hey, buddy, just don't burn the house down, okay? Let's zoom out and talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the trillion-ton gorilla swinging from the chandeliers. Washington has officially stopped caring about deficits. Gone are the days when Vice President Dick Cheney's infamous 2002 quip, "Deficits don't matter," caused a stir. Back then, people actually debated it. The national debt under Reagan ballooned from 21% of GDP to 35%, and the economy boomed, so Cheney had a point, sort of. But today? Nobody even bothers to make the argument. Deficits? Debt? Fiscal responsibility? Nah, bro, that's so 20th century. We're in the era of conscientious fiscal neglect, where the bigger the debt, the less anyone cares. And here's the data to back it up, folks. A 2010 International Monetary Fund study of 23 advanced economies found that governments are less likely to tighten fiscal policy when debt levels get insanely high. Think about that for a second. When debt is low, politicians are all, oh, we gotta be responsible. But when it spirals out of control, they just shrug and say, it's already a mess, so why bother? A more recent 2023 study on the US specifically found that fiscal feedback, the degree to which policy tightens in response to rising deficits, has plummeted since 2004, right alongside skyrocketing debt. Translation, the worse it gets, the less they do. Genius. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty, because here at Boss Economics World, we don't just rant, we educate. The cornerstone of this whole deficit mess is something called debt dynamics. Stick with me, folks, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Whether a country's debt is sustainable depends on the gap between the real interest rate on government debt and the economy's growth rate. If the interest rate is lower than the growth rate, the economy grows faster than the debt, and the debt to GDP ratio shrinks over time, even if the government runs a small deficit. Sounds like magic, right? Well, for a while, it kinda was. Post-2008 financial crisis and during the pandemic, real interest rates were not just low, they were negative. That's right, folks, the government was essentially getting paid to borrow money. According to Federal Reserve data, the real interest rate on 10-year Treasury notes averaged 1.1% from 2020 to 2022. Meanwhile, GDP growth, even adjusted for inflation, was chugging along at 2–3%. Under those conditions, deficits didn't matter much, debt to GDP ratios could fall even as the government spent like a kid in a candy store. But here's the bad news, folks, the party's over. As of mid-2025, the real interest rate on government debt is back above 2%, according to the latest Fed projections. Meanwhile, long-term GDP growth is forecasted by the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, to hover around 1.8% over the next decade. Do the math, people. When interest rates outpace growth, the debt starts growing faster than the economy, and the debt to GDP ratio explodes. To just stabilize the debt, the government needs to run a primary budget surplus, meaning revenue exceeds non-interest spending. But guess what? The CBO projects primary deficits of 2–3% of GDP for the foreseeable future, even without this new budget bill. Add in the bill's $5 trillion deficit bomb, and we're talking a fiscal adjustment of $6 trillion to $9 trillion in tax hikes or spending cuts over the next decade just to keep the debt from spiraling out of control. Good luck getting that through Congress. Now, let's talk about how Washington is trying to pull the wool over your eyes, because this budget bill is loaded with more gimmicks than a magician's hat. First off, the House is lowballing the cost of this monstrosity. They're claiming it'll only add $3 trillion to the deficit, but that's because they're using temporary measures and accounting tricks to make it look cheaper. The real cost, according to independent analysts like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, is closer to $5 trillion. Temporary tax cuts that magically expire in a few years, only to be extended later. Check. Ignoring the impact of tariffs and trade wars on economic growth. Check. Pretending that entitlement spending won't balloon as the population ages. Double check. Speaking of aging, let's talk demographics, folks. The US population is getting older faster than a bad sitcom rerun. According to the US Census Bureau, by 2035, the number of Americans aged 65 and older will outnumber those under 18 for the first time in history. What does that mean? Skyrocketing costs for Social Security, Medicare, and other entitlement programs. The CBO estimates that entitlement spending will rise from 14.9% of GDP in 2024 to 17.5% by 2035. And here's the kicker, this budget bill does nothing to address that. Instead, it just pours more fuel on the fire with tax cuts and spending sprees. It's like trying to fix a leaking dam by drilling more holes in it. Now, let's get to the scariest part, folks, the part that keeps your boy boss up at night. Interest rates. For years, the US government has been living in a fantasy world where borrowing was basically free. Low interest rates meant investors were practically begging to lend money to Uncle Sam, confident that everything would be fine. But lately, the mood has shifted. Bond markets are getting jittery, and for good reason. The 10-year Treasury yield, adjusted for inflation, is now hovering around 2.3% as of May 2025, up from near zero just a few years ago, according to Bloomberg data. And with the debt growing, the cost of servicing that debt is ballooning. The CBO projects that net interest payments will rise from $870 billion in 2024 to $1.7 trillion by 2035, more than we spend on defense or Medicare. But here's where it gets really ugly, folks. What happens if investors lose confidence in the US government's ability to manage its debt? What happens if they start demanding a risk premium, a higher interest rate, to compensate for the growing danger? We've already seen flashes of this. In late 2024, when the Trump administration pushed for more tariffs and a weaker dollar, bond yields spiked as investors panicked. And let's not forget the economic drag from those tariffs. A 2024 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that Trump-era tariffs reduced US GDP growth by 0.2% annually and cost 142,000 jobs. More tariffs, more trade wars, more uncertainty, recipe for disaster, folks. If interest rates keep rising, we could hit an inflection point where higher debt leads to higher rates, which leads to even more debt, in a vicious cycle that spirals out of control. And don't think it can't happen here. Just look at the UK in 2022, when Liz Truss's unfunded tax cuts triggered a bond market meltdown, forcing the Bank of England to intervene. The US isn't immune, people. If investors start betting against us, this whole house of cards could come crashing down faster than you can say, budget crisis. So, what's the takeaway, folks? Washington is asleep at the wheel, driving the economy straight off a cliff while blasting "Sweet Dreams" on the stereo. This budget bill isn't just reckless, it's a symptom of a deeper disease, a government that's given up on fiscal responsibility. They're betting on miracles, faster growth, lower interest rates, or maybe an alien invasion to distract us all, while ignoring the cold, hard math staring them in the face. And the worst part? They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They've stopped thinking about the debt, stopped caring about the future, and stopped pretending to be stewards of the economy. Here at Boss Economics World, we're calling it what it is, a clown show. And the clowns in charge are laughing all the way to the bank, while the rest of us, hardworking folks, small business owners, and financial professionals, are left to deal with the fallout. So, what can you do? Stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep holding these jokers accountable. Because if we don't, this circus is gonna burn down the whole darn economy. Until next time, this is your boy Boss, signing off. Peace out, and remember, the economy's a mess, but you don't have to be. Subscribe, like, and share, let's wake up the world, one viewer at a time.